Salut tout le monde! So if you saw my most recent video, which was from a couple of weeks ago, you know that that was the first time that I fully did a YouTube video in French, and I pretty much explained why I was too afraid to speak French until I was 20 years old. And right off the bat in the beginning of the video I explained, you know, French is not my maternal language, so obviously I'm going to make mistakes, and that's totally fine. But I also think that since I did record that video in French, it would be really helpful to pick out some of the mistakes that I made, and I did find quite a few. So in this video, I'm just going to talk about 10 different mistakes that I found and then explain what I should have said. And before I give you the correction and what I should have said, I highly recommend that you try finding the error on your own. Okay, c'est parti. So the first category that we're going to talk about, I believe, is pronunciation. Yeah, we're going to talk about one thing for pronunciation. We'll play the clip.
Mais t'as beaucoup de cours que tu vas continuer à suivre.
In that clip, there was a very common and obvious pronunciation error, and that is the difference between ou and u. So in that sentence, I was saying there's nobody telling me that I was younger or that I was going to continue to take courses that were going to help improve my French. And I was trying to say you are going to continue. So the word for you that I was using here was tu. However, when I pronounced it, it sounded a lot more like tout, which is the word for all or everything depending on the context. So there is a difference between tu, the person, you, and tout, the noun, everything. I actually do explain this a little more in depth in one of my very old videos, so I'm not going to get into it much here, but that definitely was one of the more obvious pronunciation mistakes that I made. So watch out for the difference between tu and tout, vu and vous, bu and bu, etc. The second category that we're going to talk about has to do with vocabulary, and for the two examples that I have under this category, I actually self-corrected myself during the video, but I do still think there's something to learn from the mistakes and the self-correction. So, first clip.
Beaucoup de personnes, peut-être beaucoup d'entre vous qui regardent cette vidéo, qui ont encore beaucoup de peur.
So what I was saying is that it makes me sad that there are still so many people who, when they're speaking French, are afraid to speak it or are too afraid to speak it. So when I was trying to say who are afraid, qui ont peur, I started out with the verb être, and I was saying qui sont peur. But that does not work in French because when you're trying to say I am afraid, what you're literally saying is I have fear. It's an avoir expression. J'ai peur. Tu as peur. Ils, elles ont peur. Nous avons peur. Vous avez peur. Ils, elles ont peur. So, like I said, I did self-correct and ended up saying qui ont beaucoup de peur, but that's definitely a mistake that I think is very common for English speakers, so look out for that.
Ou peut-être cette peur vous prévient de parler le français.
So in the sentence that comes right after, I was trying to say that this fear prevents you from speaking French. And at first, I started using the verb éviter, cette peur vous évite, but éviter, that actually means to avoid, so it's just the completely incorrect meaning. And then before I even said the whole word, I self-corrected to use the verb prévenir. That's actually the word that you would use for preventing. So now we're going to move on to the third category, which actually has to do with verb tense, and we're going to talk just about two things, and it has to do with our lovely passé composé and imparfait. So these are the two different verb tenses you can use for past tense, and you have to pick and choose when to use them, and it largely depends on context. So there are just a ton of rules that go into choosing the correct past tense. I probably could and should make a whole video on it, but for the purposes of this video, we're gonna look at two separate sentences, and I'm going to explain why they were incorrect in terms of past tense.
Il était évident que chaque fois que j'ai fait une erreur, c'était super gênant pour eux.
So I said chaque fois que j'ai fait une erreur. This is in passé composé because I'm using the auxiliary verb avoir and then the past participle after. Fait, j'ai fait. But obviously, since this is incorrect, I should have used imparfait. You want to use imperfect whenever you're talking about something that's a habit, something that happened several times. So the words chaque fois, every time, that is going to signal to you to use imparfait if you're talking in the past tense because it signifies a habit. This is not one thing that happened one time. So what I should have said was chaque fois que je faisais une erreur, and that would have been imparfait, and it would have been correct. And now the second sentence under this category.
D'abord, mes partenaires m'ignoraient complètement.
So in this sentence, I'm actually talking about a sequence of events. I'm saying first my partners did this. D'abord, my partners did this. Then this happened. Then that happened. And this is going to tell you that you should be using passé composé. When it's a sequence of events, first I did this, then I did that, then I did this, you want to use passé composé. It's kind of like the little hints to tell you this is what you should be using. So instead of saying d'abord, mes partenaires m'ignoraient, which is imparfait, I should change that to d'abord, mes partenaires m'ont ignoré. And that would be in passé composé, which would be correct. So now we're gonna move on to prepositions, which just are the absolute bane of my existence. Prepositions are so hard for me in French, and I feel like I've noticed recently that I mess prepositions up a lot in English as well, and I mean, pesky little words. So anyway, I'm just going to talk about one preposition mistake that I made, though once again, there are several others that exist in that video, but for the purpose of this video, the one I'm going to talk about has to do with registering for a course.
Je me suis inscrite dans un cours de français.
So the verb that you want to use for registering for a course or for a conference, a workshop, whatever it is not enregistrer. That's actually used when you're talking about recording something, like recording a voice note. But registering for a university class, instead you're going to use the verb, very difficult verb, s'inscrire à. So the preposition à after s'inscrire, that's not part of the verb, but it is attached to it. So in this video, I said je me suis inscrite dans un cours de français when I should have said à un cours de français. Wrong preposition. And I wish I had a better explanation, but that's just the correct preposition that comes after that verb. So the next category we're going to talk about has to do with negations, and I actually have two examples of the same mistake. This is the clip for both of them.
Personne ne voulait pas marcher avec moi. Personne n'avait pas envie de m'inclure.
So the issue with both of these sentences is that there's an extra word in there that just should not be there, and the word is pas. And right now you might be thinking, what? Like if it's a negative sentence, you're supposed to have ne and pas. Yes, but also no. So sometimes that will change. So for example, if you want to say something like I never, you would not have the word pas. Instead, it would be replaced by jamais. For example, I never sing. Je ne chante jamais. Once again, jamais is replacing pas. And if, for example, you want to say I don't like anything, you would say je n'aime rien. And the word rien, that's what's going to replace pas. You can also use the word personne if you want to say I don't like anybody. Je n'aime personne. Once again, personne is going to replace pas. The sentences that I used are a little different because the subject of the sentence, the doer of the verb, is no one. I'm trying to say no one wanted to include me. No one wanted to be my partner. And in this sense, personne is now going to be the first the first word. It's going to be the subject of the sentence, but it is still replacing pas. So you're still not having pas après. That means you're keeping the ne, you're keeping the personne, and you're just changing the placement of personne. So instead of personne ne voulait pas, da 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 da, it's just personne ne voulait, etc. Personne n'avait envie, da 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 da. D'accord? Now moving on to the last category, and I titled this Anglicisms, so Anglicisms, I think would be the word in English. But pretty much several times throughout the video, I found moments where I kind of tried translating phrases that work in English directly into French, and it just doesn't really... Ça marche pas vraiment, okay? So I was able to be understood, but once I listened back to the video and I was like, I don't know if that's what people say in French. I ended up going to the site Lingue and also Word Reference, and I tried finding phrases that seemed more natural in French. And by the way, I definitely would recommend checking out those sites if you're trying to find like a French-English dictionary that is honestly much better than just Google Translate, because these sites will actually give you context. They'll give you different sentences where the phrase or word works, and they will also give you the pronunciation of these words as well. So definitely use those tools if you're looking for some online dictionaries for French. But anyway, so I used those to help me figure out how I could Frenchify some of the Anglicisms that I was using. So I'm just going to go over two that I found in the video, and the first...
Et c'était juste un moment de plusieurs de ce semestre.
So I had just finished talking about a very humiliating moment during my early French career at my university, and I was saying this was just one of many moments. So I literally word for word said, c'était juste un moment de plusieurs. One moment of many. And I was like, I really don't think that makes sense in French, or at least I had an inkling that this wasn't exactly what French speakers would say. So after looking it up online, I instead found un moment parmi tant d'autres. So the word parmi, that means among, and then tant d'autres would be so many others. C'était un moment parmi tant d'autres. And the second one is what I'm actually talking about, how for the first time ever at university, I had a conversation with my French professor, who was also my advisor at the time. And she was the first person who had told me, like, Katie, you do speak French.
C'est pas que cette conversation a changé ma vie immédiatement.
I was trying to explain that this was a very important moment in my life, but I didn't want to make it sound as if she snapped her fingers and all of a sudden I was super confident in French. To give that little caveat, I once again just did word for word from English and I said, c'est pas que cette conversation a changé ma vie, etc., etc. C'est pas que. It's not that. And I just, once again, once I listened back to it, I was like, oh, that just sounds so English and I don't know if that makes sense in French. Again, I'm sure I'd be understood, but I just don't think that it's like French. So after looking it up, instead, I found ce n'est pas comme si. It's not as if. Comme can be like or as, in the sense it's as, and then si is used for if. Ce n'est pas comme si cette conversation a changé ma vie immédiatement. It's not as if this conversation changed my life immediately. So yeah, those are, again, just a couple of several Anglicisms that I found that I wanted to try to not so much correct as more so tweak to sound a little more French, I suppose. If there's anything that I talked about in this video that you don't quite understand, I know I kind of went through a few of those quickly, feel free to let me know in the comments. I also hope this was a good example of not being afraid of your errors, but instead using them to get better at French. And that is all for this week. À la prochaine!